Imagine a scene devastated by fire and brimstone, a place where divine judgment struck with such force that nothing remained, only ashes and silence. Now picture a man and his two daughters, alone, walking away from this scene of destruction. But does the story really end there? Or is there something darker and more surprising waiting to be uncovered? What really happened to Lot and his daughters after the destruction of Sodom? Get ready, because what we're about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew. The biblical narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah is widely known, a symbol of judgment and destruction, a warning about the consequences of corruption and sin. However, most people believe that the climax of this story is the annihilation of the cities. But what if I told you that the real mystery begins after that? Have you ever stopped to think about what happened to Lot and his daughters after they fled? There is a hidden secret, a dark and unsettling part of this story that few dare to explore. And today, we are going to unveil every detail. But why is this part of the story so often ignored? Could it be because it reveals something uncomfortable about human nature? Or perhaps because it raises difficult questions about morality, desperation, and survival? The fact is that Lot and his daughter's time in the mountains is not just an epilogue. It holds a riddle that might change the way you interpret not just this story, but also major events in the biblical narrative. What drove Lot's daughters to make such an extreme decision? And what impact did that choice have on future generations? Imagine the despair. A man who watched his city consumed by flames, who lost everything, including his wife, turned into a pillar of salt. Now he lives in isolation, seeking refuge in a cave with his two daughters. The world they knew is gone. They believed they were the last survivors of an entire civilization. In this setting of fear, loneliness, and uncertainty, decisions were made, decisions that changed the course of history. What were those decisions, and why do they still resonate to this day? Throughout this video, we will dive deep into the mysteries surrounding Lot and his daughters. We will analyze every detail, question intentions, explore the cultural context of the time, and reflect on the spiritual significance of this narrative. Why did the Bible make a point to record such a disturbing story? What did God want to teach us through it? Get ready for a true investigative journey. This will not be just a biblical account, but a path of discovery and deep reflection. And I invite you to stay until the end of this video. The revelations ahead are surprising and may change your perspective. Have we been too quick to judge Lot and his daughters? Are there hidden lessons in this story waiting to be uncovered? Every detail matters. Every decision they made had a lasting impact. The hidden secret after the destruction of Sodom may hold answers to questions you never even thought to ask. If this topic has already sparked your interest, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here, we always bring deep reflections that challenge traditional interpretations. And share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think motivated Lot and his daughter's decisions? Your insights can enrich this investigation even further. Let's unravel this mystery together and discover what really happened after the destruction of Sodom. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most striking episodes in the Bible. Imagine the scene. Two cities consumed by corruption, violence, and immorality, doomed to a tragic end by divine judgment. In the midst of the impending chaos, Lot, a man who had chosen to live there, receives an unexpected visit. Angels sent by God. They bring a clear and urgent warning. Flee for your life. Do not look back, and do not stop anywhere in the plain. The tension at this moment is palpable. Lot and his family's lives depended on their obedience to a simple yet crucial command. But would obeying really be that easy? Lot's wife hesitated. She looked back, and that single act of disobedience changed everything. Transformed into a pillar of salt, her story became a symbol of the danger of clinging to the past. But what really made this woman look back? Was it longing, disbelief, or the inability to leave behind the life she once knew? This brief pause during their escape reveals the human struggle between the desire to move forward and the fear of abandoning what is familiar, even when what is familiar is doomed. This hesitation echoes even today. How many times do we ourselves look back, unable to let go of what we should have left behind? Lot and his daughters pressed on. Every second mattered. They reached Zoar, a small town where Lot believed they would be safe. But relief was short-lived. Fear persisted. Although Zoar had escaped the initial destruction, Lot did not trust that it was truly secure. Was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah just the beginning? What if other cities were also doomed? The psychological terror of having barely escaped such immense devastation was suffocating. This uncertainty, this constant fear, pushed them toward an even lonelier fate. The mountains. And here we reach a crucial point: fear. Even after escaping destruction, Lot and his daughters became prisoners of terror. Zoar offered shelter, but the trauma of loss and the feeling of insecurity weighed heavier. They abandoned the city and isolated themselves in a cave in the mountains. But was physical isolation enough to protect them from the emotional ghosts that haunted them? This continuous flight raises a profound question. To what extent can fear keep us from truly living even when the danger has passed? This part of the story teaches us a powerful lesson. Even after escaping destruction, fear can still imprison us. How many times in our lives do we survive difficult moments only to remain trapped in trauma, distrust, and anxiety? Lot and his daughters were physically free, but emotionally, they were still captives of the horrors they had witnessed. They had left behind a city in flames, but they carried with them the ashes of fear and uncertainty. This narrative sparks an essential reflection. Are we truly free when we allow fear to dictate our choices? Lot believed he had found salvation, but his decision to isolate himself in the mountains shows that sometimes the greatest challenge comes after the storm, when we must learn to trust again, rebuild and move forward. And it is in this context of isolation, despair, and uncertainty that the darkest secret of this story begins to unfold. Imagine absolute silence. No city in sight, no voices, only the echo of the wind between the cold stones of a cave in the mountains. This was where Lot and his daughters took refuge, isolated from the world, far from Zoar, and even more distant from the life they once knew. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah had left an emptiness not only around them, but within them. For Lot, that makeshift shelter represented safety. But for his daughters, isolation would soon become an unbearable burden. And in this suffocating environment, a controversial plan began to take shape. Lot's daughters looked around and saw what they believed to be the end of civilization. The devastation they had witnessed led them to a terrifying conclusion. They might be the last women alive. With this grim belief weighing upon them, an even greater fear emerged: the extinction of their father's lineage. In a time when continuing the family name was seen as essential, the idea of complete extinction seemed unacceptable. But what kind of decision would someone make when they truly believed they were the last link to humanity? Desperation can cloud judgment, and that is exactly what happened. With no prospects, no hope, and convinced that the world had ended, Lot's daughters conceived an audacious and morally questionable plan: to intoxicate their father and lie with him in order to preserve his lineage. A plan that in any context would seem unthinkable, but in their minds, it was an extreme measure for an extreme situation. They genuinely believed that the survival of their lineage, perhaps of humanity itself, depended on that choice. This part of the biblical narrative raises profound questions. How can isolation distort our perception of reality? When we are isolated, physically or emotionally, the mind can construct dangerous narratives. Lot's daughters, deprived of contact with other people and information, truly believed they were alone in the world. This extreme sense of loneliness led them to justify actions that, under normal circumstances, would be unthinkable. Desperation can indeed drive people to questionable decisions. But where was Lot in all of this? A father who had been warned by angels, spared from destruction, and yet now lived in a cave, consumed by fear and apathy. Lot did not lead, nor did he guide his daughters toward a new beginning. He simply sought refuge, paralyzed by trauma. And here arises another crucial reflection. When leadership fails, desperation takes control. Had Lot maintained his faith and leadership, would things have turned out differently? The decision made by Lot's daughters reveals just how far humanity can go in the name of survival. It is a narrative that unsettles, that provokes discomfort, but at the same time, it forces us to ask, what would we do in a situation where everything seems lost? When the future appears non-existent, what choices seem justifiable? This is where the story becomes profoundly human. The mistake of Lot's daughters was not merely a moral transgression, it was the reflection of an absolute fear of being the last of their kind. Isolation, therefore, was not only physical, it was also emotional, spiritual, and mental. In a world they believed had vanished, they created their own logic, where the unforgivable seemed to be the only solution. This part of the story reminds us that, more often than not, the gravest mistakes are made when all hope is lost. Their error was severe, but in their distorted perspective, was it not the only possible path? The great lesson in this moment is clear and disturbing. Desperation can lead to questionable decisions. When the future appears as a void, the line between right and wrong can become dangerously thin. What happened in that cave? Was it a one-time act of despair, or the first piece of a legacy that would shape biblical history? The answer, surprising and revealing, is about to unfold. The silence of the cave concealed a secret that would alter the course of history. Lot's daughters, consumed by despair, had devised a plan that, at first glance, seemed utterly unacceptable. But what could drive two women to orchestrate something so controversial? In a moment where they believed they were the last survivors of humanity, the instinct for preservation outweighed all else. They decided to intoxicate their father and, without his knowledge, conceive children with him. A risky plan, surrounded by moral and spiritual dilemmas. But why did Lot not realize what was happening? And more importantly, was this episode merely an act of desperation, or was there a deeper symbolic meaning behind this narrative? The most intriguing detail in this story is the role of intoxication. Lot's daughters understood that for their plan to succeed, their father had to be completely unaware. His drunkenness was not just a minor detail, it was a crucial strategy. And here arises a disturbing question. Lot, a man spared from the judgment of Sodom, was manipulated by his own daughters without even knowing it. But did he really not know? Or does the biblical narrative seek to tell us something more? The use of wine and intoxication carries powerful symbolism in Scripture. This was not the first time alcohol was associated with disastrous decisions. The story of Noah, for example, presents an interesting parallel. After the flood, Noah became drunk and ended up in a shameful situation that had consequences for future generations. Just like Noah, Lot found himself in an event where intoxication led to actions that would shape the destiny of many. Could this be a veiled message about the dangers of vulnerability, or a warning that when self-control is lost, unthinkable decisions can be made? Another key aspect to consider is the possible cultural influence on Lot's daughter's decision. At that time, preserving the family lineage was of utmost importance. Descendants ensured not only continuity, but also protection and prosperity. In some ancient cultures, controversial practices were adopted in extreme situations to secure lineage. Could Lot's daughters have been influenced by this mindset? Their belief that the world had ended and that they were the last women alive may have reinforced the idea that their actions were justified. But we cannot ignore the tragic irony in this story. Lot, who had once offered his daughters to the men of Sodom in a moment of peril, now found himself, albeit unknowingly, at the center of an act that bore the marks of the very moral corruption he had tried to escape. This twist suggests that even far from Sodom, the corrupted values of the city still lingered over his family. Evil was not just in Sodom. It was also within hearts scarred by fear and despair. The plan was carried out over 2 consecutive nights. On the first night, the elder daughter got her father drunk and lay with him. The following night, the younger daughter did the same. Lot had no knowledge of what had happened on either occasion, or so the narrative tells us. But was Lot truly just a victim of intoxication? Or does this story conceal a deeper message about responsibility, negligence, and the consequences of drifting away from God? This dark episode highlights a recurring theme in the Bible: deception. The story of Lot and his daughters connects to other pivotal moments, such as Rebekah and Jacob's deception to obtain Isaac's blessing, or the trickery of Laban's daughters concerning Jacob. In all these cases, deception had consequences that echoed for generations. The biblical narrative seems to remind us that choices driven by fear, despair, or greed rarely come without lasting repercussions. And the consequences of this decision did not take long to manifest. Lot's daughters became pregnant and bore 2 sons, Moab and Ammon. These names would later become synonymous with entire nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites. Nations that, throughout biblical history, would have complex and often hostile relations with Israel. It is astonishing how an act committed in an isolated cave, motivated by desperation, led to repercussions that spanned generations and deeply impacted the history of God's people. The great lesson in this episode is clear and profound. The absence of hope can lead to unthinkable choices. When the future appears non-existent and fear dominates, the human mind can justify actions that, under normal circumstances, would be unimaginable. Lot's daughter's plan was not merely an isolated act of desperation, it was an event that altered history. Deception, intoxication, and despair gave birth to a legacy that would intertwine in complex and unexpected ways with the messianic lineage. Yet what seemed like an irreparable mistake would still play a crucial role in the grand narrative of redemption. The plan was completed. From the questionable union between Lot and his daughters, 2 sons were born, Moab and Ammon. At first glance, these names might seem like mere details at the end of a story marked by despair. However, these boys would grow up to become the founders of 2 nations that played crucial and controversial roles in biblical history, the Moabites and the Ammonites. Here, the script of humanity takes a surprising turn. What seemed like an irreparable mistake took on a significance far greater than anyone could have imagined. The legacy of these decisions would resonate for generations, bringing consequences far beyond a single act of desperation. The Moabites and Ammonites emerged quite literally from a moment of deception and despair. Both peoples settled in lands near Israel, and over time, their relationships with God's chosen people were marked by tensions, conflicts, and deep mistrust. These nations are frequently mentioned in Scripture as opponents of Israel, engaging in wars and intrigues. The weight of Moab and Ammon's birth, therefore, was not merely personal or familial, it was historical. The choices made in that cave, driven by fear and hopelessness, resulted in the formation of peoples who would repeatedly challenge Israel. The desperation of 2 women, combined with the apathy of a father, created a national and spiritual impact that would shape biblical history. However, the biblical narrative is always full of surprises. The story of Moab, for example, takes an astonishing turn with the appearance of Ruth, the Moabite. Ruth, a descendant of a people born out of a questionable act, becomes a model of faithfulness, love, and redemption. She abandons her land, her people, and her gods to follow her mother-in-law Naomi and serve the God of Israel. Her story is so significant that she becomes a direct ancestor of King David and ultimately of the messianic lineage of Jesus Christ. How could a people with such controversial origins produce someone so essential to the story of redemption? This unexpected development teaches a powerful lesson. Even wrong choices can be redeemed in God's plan. The birth of Moab and Ammon, though originating in a dark context, was not an obstacle to divine purpose. In his sovereignty, God used even the consequences of human mistakes to fulfill his greater will. The presence of Ruth in Jesus' lineage is undeniable proof that God's grace is greater than any past failure. A narrative that began in deception and despair transformed into a story of hope and restoration. Ben-Ami, the founder of the Ammonites, also left a lasting legacy. Though historically hostile to Israel, the Ammonites' interactions with God's people played a role in shaping Israel's history. The conflicts with the Israelites forced the nation to reaffirm its identity, depend on God's guidance, and remain faithful to his covenant. Even in opposition, these encounters served as important lessons in obedience and trust in God's plans. The rise of the Moabites and Ammonites demonstrates that no event in the biblical narrative is random. Every detail, no matter how obscure, has a role in the grand story of humanity. Reflecting on the birth of Moab and Ben-Ami, we realize a profound truth. Human mistakes, no matter how severe, cannot derail God's plans. What seemed to be a tragic ending for Lot's lineage actually became an essential link in God's redemptive story. The story of Lot and his daughters reminds us that even the darkest pages of our personal history can be rewritten into chapters of redemption and divine purpose. After all, when God writes the story, even human failure can become part of his perfect plan. The story of Lot and his daughters goes beyond a controversial account of desperation and questionable decisions. More than anything, it is a profound invitation to spiritual reflection. Every detail of this narrative carries powerful lessons about the consequences of human choices and the astonishing ability of God to transform mistakes into purpose. After all, what can this seemingly uncomfortable story teach us about redemption, trust, and God's divine plan? What is the hidden spiritual meaning behind each act committed in that cave? First, we need to examine the spiritual consequences of choices made in despair. Lot's daughter's deception resulted in two nations that, for generations, would be enemies of Israel. The Moabites and Ammonites were born out of fear and hopelessness, and their historical actions reflect the scars of this troubled origin. The Bible shows us that decisions motivated by fear and lack of faith have long-lasting impacts, not just personal, but collective. Sin, in this context, does not only affect the one who commits it, it echoes across generations. Thus, we learn that every choice carries spiritual weight, often far beyond the present moment. On the other hand, this story also connects with the central theme of the Bible, redemption. Even after such a grave mistake, God found a way to redefine what seemed lost. Ruth, the Moabite, emerges as the ultimate symbol of redemption. She chose to leave her homeland and culture to follow the God of Israel, becoming a crucial part of the messianic lineage. This teaches us that God is not limited by human errors. He turns tragedies into testimonies and uses even the results of wrong decisions to fulfill his eternal purposes. Another spiritual aspect of this narrative is the role of women in the continuation of the biblical lineage. Lot's daughters, though they made condemnable choices, played a crucial role in preserving a lineage that would later be woven into the story of redemption. This detail reveals a repeated pattern in the Bible, where women, even in difficult circumstances, are key figures in God's plan. This leads us to reflect on the importance of every individual and how even reckless decisions can still be used within a greater divine purpose. Furthermore, the story of Lot and his daughters emphasizes the importance of trusting in God, even in times of uncertainty. Lot's daughters made an extreme decision because they believed there was no hope left. Isolation, fear, and a limited view of the future led them to act on their own accord. Yet had they trusted in God, they would have realized they were not alone and that their story was far from over. This spiritual lesson reminds us that when we try to control everything on our own, we risk taking paths that stray from God's plan. The great spiritual lesson of this story is clear and impactful. God can transform even the most improbable situations into something meaningful. Even when everything seems lost, even when our past is filled with mistakes, God is still able to intervene and rewrite the story. He turns failures into tools for growth and uses even acts born out of despair as part of his perfect plan. Thus, the story of Lot and his daughters is not just about mistakes, it is about hope. A hope that reminds us that no matter what happened yesterday, there is always a greater purpose waiting to be revealed tomorrow. The story of Lot and his daughters, though it took place millennia ago, continues to echo powerful and deeply relevant lessons for today. It challenges us to reflect on how fear, uncertainty, and desperation can influence our decisions. After all, how often do we, when faced with difficult situations, feel tempted to seek immediate and impulsive solutions without considering the long-term consequences? This account forces us to face the harsh reality that our choices, even those made in moments of weakness, hold the power to impact generations. One of the most striking lessons from this story is the danger of allowing fear to dictate our actions. Lot's daughters believed there was no future left. Their isolation in the mountains and lack of hope led them to make extreme decisions. Similarly, in our daily lives, fear of the unknown, failure, or loneliness can push us toward rash actions. When fear takes over, it blinds us to alternatives, making us believe that desperate choices are our only option. This narrative warns us, fear can be just as destructive as the danger we are running from. Another crucial lesson is the importance of trusting in God, even when circumstances seem hopeless. Lot and his daughters faced a desperate situation, but their decision to act on their own understanding led to deep and lasting consequences. This lesson is highly relevant today. In times of crisis, faith becomes essential. Trusting in a greater plan requires patience and courage. This story reminds us that no matter how dark the circumstances appear, acting without divine guidance can lead us down dangerous paths. Faith in God is the antidote to decisions driven by panic. We also learn about the impact of our choices on future generations. The plan devised by Lot's daughters resulted in the birth of two nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites, that profoundly influenced the history of Israel. This leads us to ask, what decisions are we making today that will affect those who come after us? Our actions, values, and attitudes create a legacy. Whether in family, work, or society, each choice shapes the path for those who follow. This responsibility should motivate us to act with wisdom and discernment, ensuring that the mark we leave behind is one of faith, integrity, and purpose. Additionally, Lot's story teaches us how to avoid making similar mistakes. The key is to recognize the signs of despair and fear in our own lives. When we face moments of uncertainty, it is vital to seek wise counsel, strengthen our faith, and remember that not every immediate solution is the right one. We must learn to identify impulsive decisions and replace them with choices rooted in trust, hope, and purpose. Many times, waiting for the right guidance can spare us from devastating consequences. The great lesson this story offers is both profound and necessary. A lack of faith in the future can lead us to seek human solutions that are not part of God's plan. In a world that values quick results and instant answers, the story of Lot and his daughters reminds us that not everything that seems urgent is truly necessary. Faith requires time, patience, and above all, trust that tomorrow can be better than today. And when we trust in God, we discover that even the mistakes of the past can be transformed into part of a greater purpose. The story of Lot and his daughters is, without a doubt, uncomfortable. It exposes the darkest side of human decisions and reveals how fear, despair, and a lack of hope can lead us down unthinkable paths. However, as we have explored throughout this narrative, there is far more hidden beneath the surface. Every detail in this story leads us to a profound reflection. Do we judge Lot and his daughters without fully understanding their circumstances? Could it be that behind each controversial choice there is a spiritual lesson we need to absorb? The truth is, this story has much more to teach us than we might have imagined. As we revisit each stage of this journey, we realize that the true secret is not just the act committed in the cave, but rather the spiritual lessons that emerge from it. We learn that fear can be an invisible prison, controlling our decisions and preventing us from seeing a better future. We discover that desperation, if left unchecked, can lead us to justify choices we never thought we would make. And most importantly, we come to understand that our actions, no matter how private, can echo for generations, shaping legacies and influencing destinies. This narrative forces us to recognize that the choices we make today may have unimaginable consequences tomorrow. However, the most astonishing lesson in this story is the revelation of God's grace and sovereignty. Who would have imagined that from such a dark event would emerge a lineage leading directly to the Messiah? The presence of Ruth, the Moabite, in the genealogy of Jesus Christ is one of the greatest biblical declarations of redemption. Even wrong choices, when placed in God's hands, can be transformed into essential parts of His perfect plan. This reminds us that no human mistake is too great to frustrate God's purposes. God specializes in turning tragedies into testimonies and failures into foundations for something greater. Now I leave you with a final, thought-provoking question. Lot and his daughter's story is difficult, but could it be that it teaches us more than we realize? Could it be that the darkest moments in our own lives, marked by poor choices, can still be transformed by God into instruments of redemption and purpose? This story invites us to reflect on how we view our own mistakes and the mistakes of others. If God was able to use such a complex and uncomfortable narrative to accomplish His plans, what can He do with our own story? Thus, the great truth revealed here is simple but powerful. The choices we make today can impact entire generations in the future. Every decision made in times of crisis, every choice driven by fear or hope, shapes not only our destiny, but also the destiny of those who come after us. Just as Lot and his daughter's actions influence the history of entire nations, our attitudes also create lasting legacies. That is why we must choose wisely, guided by faith and trust in God. If this video helped you see this story from a new perspective, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment and tell us what impacted you most about this story. Do you believe that your choices today can echo into the future? Subscribe to the channel to follow more content like this, where we explore biblical narratives from a new perspective, uncovering hidden secrets and lessons that remain relevant to this day. After all, every story has something to teach us, even those we prefer to ignore.